Michigan, a state defined by hard work, close-knit communities, and people who look out for their own. But it's also produced some of the most disturbing killers in America, and not the ones you'd expect. Because the women in this documentary weren't strangers lurking in the dark. They were wives, mothers, grandmothers, nurses, neighbors, the people you'd trust without a second thought, right up until the moment it was far too late. When each of these cases broke, the reaction was always the same: shock, disbelief, neighbors insisting there had to be some mistake, that the woman they knew could never have done such a thing. But the evidence said otherwise, and one by one, juries agreed. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. And if you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications because we release a brand new true crime documentary every week. So settle in, because in Michigan, the most dangerous person in the room was often the last one you'd ever suspect. Mitchell Blair, Detroit, Michigan. On the morning of March 24, 2015, a court-appointed eviction crew arrived at an apartment in the Martin Luther King Apartments on Detroit's east side. It was routine work: a family behind on rent, furniture to be carried out, another unit to be cleared. The tenant wasn't home, so the crew let themselves in and began moving her belongings. In the living room stood a white, stand-alone deep freezer. When a Wayne County Sheriff's bailiff lifted the lid, the work stopped. Inside, wrapped in a large plastic bag, was the frozen body of a teenage girl, and underneath her, wrapped in bedding, was the body of a young boy. They were Stoney Ann Blair, 13, and her brother Stephen Gage Berry, 9. They had been dead for years, and they had been in that living room, a few feet from where the family ate and slept the entire time. The woman who put them there was their mother, Mitchell Blair. Stoney and Stephen were two of Blair's 4 children. Stoney was her eldest daughter, a girl who, by the time she died, had spent much of her short life in a home her own sister would later describe as a place of constant fear. Stephen was the younger of the two, just 9 years old. Their mother, then in her mid-30s, was raising all 4 children in that Detroit apartment. To the outside world, the family had simply gone quiet. 2 children stopped being seen. No school reported them missing. No agency came looking. And for more than 2 years, the silence held. The timeline investigators eventually assembled was this: Stephen died first, in August of 2012, at the age of 9. His body was placed at the bottom of the appliance. 9 months later, in May of 2013, his 13-year-old sister Stoney died as well, and she was laid on top of her little brother. Autopsies would later determine that both children had been beaten to death. After each dia, their mother closed the lid and simply carried on. She kept living in the apartment. She kept raising her 2 surviving children in the same rooms, and she continued to collect public assistance benefits for children who were no longer alive. The 2 children who survived, a daughter and a younger son, grew up in that apartment for years, knowing what was in the corner of the living room. Blair's eldest surviving daughter later described it in words that are hard to shake. She said she was afraid to even walk past it. Every time she came downstairs to eat breakfast or play a video game, she had to go right by it. She knew what was inside, and she understood there was nowhere else her mother could have hidden them. What finally exposed it all was not a tip or an investigation or a neighbor's suspicion. It was an unpaid rent bill. Had the eviction never happened, it is entirely possible that lid would never have been lifted at all. The response was immediate. Blair wasn't at the apartment when the discovery was made, but a neighbor told police where to find her, and she was taken into custody that same day. On March 26, 2015, she was arraigned by video at Detroit's 36th District Court, initially on 5 child abuse charges, 4 counts of first-degree child abuse, and 1 count of child abuse committed in the presence of another child. She was held on a $1 million bond. Once the autopsy results came back, the case changed completely. Prosecutors amended the charges to include premeditated murder, felony murder, and torture. What emerged as the case moved forward was, if anything, more disturbing than the discovery itself. Blair did not deny killing her children. She admitted it, repeatedly and without hesitation. Her justification was an accusation she leveled at the children themselves. She claimed that Stoney and Stephen had harmed a younger sibling. But that claim collapsed under the most basic scrutiny. She had never witnessed anything. She had never reported anything to police or to any authority. And Wayne County Assistant Prosecutor Karen Goldfarb stated plainly that there was no evidence whatsoever to support the accusation. 2 children who could no longer speak for themselves were being blamed for their own deaths on the word of the person who killed them. Mental health experts examined Blair and found her competent to stand trial, and rather than fight the charges, she moved to end the case as quickly as possible. In June of 2015, less than 3 months after the bodies were found, Mitchell Blair pleaded guilty to 1 count of first-degree premeditated murder and 1 count of felony murder. In court that day, she offered a statement that stunned everyone who heard it, saying she didn't regret any of it and felt no remorse. She would also say that if Michigan still had the sanzandandato, a death penalty, she would take it. Her sentencing came on July 17, 2015, before Wayne County Circuit Judge Dana Hathaway. In her remarks, the judge said Blair's children had lived in fear of her and described the apartment as a house of horrors she had created for all 4 of them. Then came the exchange that would define the case. "You imposed the death penalty on your own children," Hathaway told her. Blair's reply was 2 words: "I did." The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. From the discovery of the bodies to a final sentence, the entire case had taken less than 4 months. Wayne County Prosecutor Kim Worthy said afterward that the sentence closed a tragic and shocking chapter surrounding the very short lives of Stoney Blair and Stephen Barry, that there were no winners in the case, only losers, and that she hoped the children could finally rest. There was one more matter to settle. On July 27, 2015, Wayne County Family Judge Edward Joseph permanently terminated Blair's parental rights to her 2 surviving children. They were placed with a great-aunt, returned to school, and entered therapy to begin recovering from what they had lived through. Blair's younger surviving son was eventually adopted. Mitchell Blair remains incarcerated at the Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Ypsilanti, Michigan, where she will spend the rest of her life. The case sent a shock through Detroit and far beyond it, and it prompted hard questions that still linger, chiefly how 2 children could vanish from the world for years without a single system noticing. But the part that should outlast the headlines isn't the appliance, or the eviction, or the courtroom. It's Stoney Ann Blair and Stephen Gage Barry, 13 and 9 years old, who died in the one place a child is supposed to be safest, at the hands of the one person meant to protect them. They deserved a childhood. They never got one, and they deserve to be remembered by their names. Kelly Cochran, Iron River, Michigan. On May 17, 2016, in a wooded area off Pentoga Trail in Crystal Falls Township in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, investigators finally found what they'd been searching for over a year and a half: the skull and eyeglasses of a missing man named Christopher Regan. What made the discovery so chilling wasn't just that Regan had been murdered. It was who led police to the remains. Standing there in those woods, guiding investigators to the very spot, was the woman who had helped kill him, Kelly Cochran. And by the time the case was over, Regan wouldn't be the only person she'd be convicted of killing. The second victim would be her own husband. The story begins in the small, quiet communities of Iron County, near the Wisconsin border. Christopher Regan was 53, a divorced father and an Air Force veteran, remembered by those who knew him as warm and full of life. A man who loved the outdoors and hiking through the Upper Peninsula's forests. He worked at a local facility, and it was there that he met a co-worker named Kelly Cochran. Kelly was in her early 30s, married, and living in the town of Caspian with her husband, Jason Cochran. In the autumn of 2014, Kelly and Regan began an affair. But this was not an ordinary affair, because Kelly Cochran's marriage was not an ordinary marriage. According to the case prosecutors would later build, Kelly and Jason had made a pact, a dark agreement that if either of them ever cheated, they would kill the other person involved. Whether that pact was formed in deadly seriousness or something darker still, its consequences were very real. When Kelly's relationship with Regan deepened, and she came to believe he wasn't interested in the long-term future she wanted, the affair curdled, and the pact came due. On October 14, 2014, Kelly lured Christopher Regan to the home she shared with Jas, son and Caspian. Regan believed he was coming to see Kelly. Instead, Jason Cochran was waiting, and Regan was fatally shot. What the Cochrans did next is the part of the case that horrified even seasoned investigators. In the basement of their home, the couple dismembered Regan's body, and then they scattered his remains in the forest off Pentoga Trail. Then they cleaned up, and they carried on as though nothing had happened. Christopher Regan simply vanished. His disappearance did not go unnoticed. Regan was reliable, connected to his family, and when he stopped answering, people worried. The missing person investigation fell to the Iron River Police Department and to its chief, Laura Frizzo, who would become the driving force behind cracking the case. Almost immediately, investigators identified Kelly Cochran, the co-worker Regan had been seeing, and the last person known to have been with him, as a person of interest, along with her husband. But suspecting them and proving anything were two very different things. There was no body. There was no crime scene anyone could see, and the Cochrans weren't talking. For months, the investigation ground forward with little to show for it. Then the Cochrans left Michigan altogether, moving to Hobart, Indiana. And it was there, in early 2016, that the second death occurred. On February 20th, 2016, Jason Cochran died in their Hobart home. At first it was treated as a drug overdose, but the truth, which Kelly herself would later reveal, was that she had killed him, smothering and strangling him. Her stated reason was as cold as anything in the case. She told investigators she killed Jason because he had taken the only good thing in her life, meaning Regan. The woman who had helped murder her lover had now murdered her husband in revenge for that same lover's death. Jason's death, strangely, is what finally broke the case open. As investigators in both states closed in, Kelly Cochran began to talk. In April of 2016, she gave a detailed statement admitting her role in Regan's death, how she'd lured him to the house, how Jason had shot him, how they'd dismembered and hidden the body. And in May, she led investigators straight to Regan's remains off Pentoga Trail. It was the confession and cooperation of the killer herself that turned a stalled missing person case into a double murder. Her prosecution. Kelly Cochran's trial for the murder of Christopher Regan took place in February of 2017 in Iron County. On the stand, she changed her story, now claiming that Jason had acted alone and that she'd only helped conceal the body out of fear for her own life. The jury didn't believe her. Under Michigan law, a person who aids and abets a murder is just as guilty as the one who pulls the trigger. And the prosecution argued Kelly was a full partner in Regan's death, bound to her husband by that murder pact. After a trial lasting more than 2 weeks, the jury of 8 women and 4 men deliberated less than 3 hours before convicting her on every count: first-degree murder, conspiracy to mutilate a body, concealing a death, larceny, and lying to police. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She later appealed, and in 2019, the Michigan Court of Appeals upheld the conviction. Then came the reckoning for the second killing. In April of 2018, back in Lake County, Indiana, Kelly Cochran pleaded guilty to murdering her husband, Jason. In exchange for the plea, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. On May 16, 2018, she was sentenced to 65 years in prison for Jason's murder, a term to be served consecutively, on top of her Michigan life sentence. 2 states, 2 convictions, 2 dead men. The case drew national attention, spawning television documentaries and true crime specials, and earning Kelly Cochran the nickname the Devil Woman of Michigan. Some of those retellings have floated darker, more sensational claims. that she may have been responsible for many more deaths, even that she kept trophies from her victims. It's worth being clear and honest about this. Those claims were never proven. In fact, the very investigators who put her away, including Chief Frizzo, testified that they found no evidence a bag of victim trophies ever existed. What Kelly Cochran was actually convicted of is chilling enough without embellishment. She helped murder and dismember the man she was having an affair with, then killed her own husband in revenge, and calmly led police through the aftermath of both. In a jailhouse interview years later, Kelly Cochran offered an explanation for how her life had turned out that was, in its own way, more unsettling than any rumor. She said she had simply grown bored, that she'd done everything she was supposed to do, gone to school, gotten married, gone to work, and found it wasn't enough. 2 men were dead, and she remains today at the Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Michigan, where she is serving a life sentence. With 65 more years waiting in Indiana, she will never live to serve. Gwendolyn Graham, Kathy Wood, Walker, Michigan. On the evening of October 7, 1988, a man named Ken Wood walked into the police station in Walker, Michigan, a suburb of Grand Rapids, carrying a story so disturbing that the detectives who heard it at first refused to believe it. His ex-wife, he said, had come to him and confessed to something monstrous, that she and a co-worker at a local nursing home had murdered a series of elderly patients, helpless, dementia-stricken women, and had done it, essentially, for love. A retired detective on the case later admitted his first reaction was plain disbelief. Who, he wondered, would kill disabled people? But as investigators pulled at the thread Ken Wood had handed them, they uncovered one of the most notorious cases in Michigan history, a case that, nearly 40 years later, is still being argued over. The 2 women at the center of it were Gwendolyn Graham and Catherine Wood, known as Kathy. Both worked as nurses' aides at the Alpine Manor Nursing Home in Walker, caring for elderly residents, many of them suffering from Alzheimer's and advanced dementia. Graham was a young woman who had moved to Michigan from Texas in the mid-1980s. Kathy Wood was a recently divorced local woman who, for a time, was Graham's supervisor at the facility. The 2 grew close, and by 1986 they had become romantic partners. Their relationship, by every account that followed, was intense, possessive, and volatile. And it was out of that relationship, according to the case that would later be built, that the killings were born. The account given to police described a chilling motive. Graham and Wood, it was said, wanted a secret so dark that neither could ever leave the other, a shared crime that would bind them together forever. The idea, as it was described, began almost as a grim game. The plan was to choose victims whose first initials LD one by one spell out the word murder, but the very first intended victim reportedly fought back harder than expected, and the alphabet scheme was abandoned. Instead, the pair allegedly turned to the most defenseless residents in the home, frail, elderly women with dementia who were physically unable to resist, and whose deaths, in a nursing home full of the very old and very sick, would raise no alarm. Over the first half of 1987, 5 women died at Alpine Manor under circumstances that, at the time, drew no suspicion at all. Their names were Mae Mason, 79, Edith Cook, 98, Marguerite Chambers, 60, Myrtle Luce, 95, and Belle Burkhard, 74. Every one of them was elderly, and most were deep in the grip of Alzheimer's or dementia. According to the account investigators assembled, they were smothered, suffocated with a washcloth, while one woman kept watch at the door. Because the victims were so frail and their deaths seemed so ordinary for a nursing home, no autopsies were performed. The families grieved, believing their mothers and grandmothers had simply reached the end of long, difficult declines. For more than a year, no one suspected a thing. What broke the silence was the collapse of Graham and Wood's relationship. After the 2 split and Graham eventually moved back toward Texas, Kathy Wood unburdened herself to her ex-husband Ken, and Ken went to the police. His statement launched an investigation led by the Walker Police Department, and detectives began the grim work of exhuming bodies and interviewing staff. In December of 1988, both women were arrested, Wood in Walker and Graham in Tyler, Texas. From the very beginning, the two told completely different stories, and that conflict sits at the heart of this case even now. Kathy Wood became the prosecution's key witness. In exchange for a reduced charge, second-degree murder, and a sentence of 20 to 40 years, Wood agreed to testify against Graham. She told the court that Graham was the one who physically smothered the patients, while she herself had only acted as a lookout, distracting supervisors and standing guard. Graham, for her part, insisted she was innocent. She maintained that the murders had never really happened at all, that the whole thing had started as dark, tasteless humor between two people, a running joke that Wood, whom she described as a manipulative liar, had spun into a false confession and then into courtroom testimony. The physical evidence was thin. Autopsies on exhumed patients did not conclusively prove murder. Suffocation of a frail elderly person often leaves little trace. What the case largely rested on was Wood's testimony, supported by a crucial piece of corroboration. Graham's own new girlfriend testified that Graham had admitted to her that she had killed 5 people. That admission, from someone with no obvious reason to lie, appears to have been decisive. On November 3, 1989, a jury found Gwendolyn Graham guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder. She was sentenced to 5 terms of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Kathy Wood, under her plea deal, served her lesser sentence and was ultimately released on parole in 2020, after roughly 3 decades behind bars. The case became infamous. The 2 women were branded the lethal lovers and the angels of death, and their story was retold in a best-selling book, in podcasts, and in true crime television for decades. But that same book, and the years of scrutiny that followed, also gave oxygen to a persistent and serious question. What if Graham was telling the truth? Some who examined the case came to see Kathy Wood as the genuinely calculating figure, a skilled manipulator who may have exaggerated or even fabricated the story, and who had every incentive to pin the killings on Graham in order to save herself. That question is not merely academic, and it is not history. As recently as May of 2026, the Michigan Innocence Clinic filed a lengthy petition seeking clemency and a pardon for Graham, who is now in their 60s and identifies as a transgender man, arguing flatly that the murders never happened, that dark workplace humor was mistaken for a criminal confession, and that there was never any physical proof that anyone at Alpine Manor was killed at all. Remarkably, that petition includes a letter of support from Kathy Wood's own daughter. Prosecutors and the families of the victims, however, have long stood by the conviction, and it remains fully in force. So this is where the case rests. Legally, the matter is settled. A jury convicted Gwendolyn Graham of murdering 5 women, and that conviction has stood for more than 35 years. But unlike almost any other case, a genuine and active dispute continues over whether the crimes ever occurred. A debate playing out in real time in the present day. What is beyond dispute is that 5 elderly women, Mae Mason, Edith Cook, Marguerite Chambers, Myrtle Luce, and Belle Burkhard, died at Alpine Manor in 1987 in a place where their families had trusted they would be safe. Sherry Miller, Flint, Michigan. On the evening of November 8, 1999, in the Flint area of Michigan, a man named Bruce Miller was found dead inside the office of his own business, a salvage yard called BD Auto Parts. Bruce, 48 years old, had been shot with a shotgun. Around $2,000 in cash was missing, and at first glance, it looked like a robbery that had turned deadly. Investigators had no obvious suspect and no clear motive. What none of them could have guessed, standing in that junkyard office, was that the answer wouldn't be found at the scene at all. It would be found on a computer, 800 miles away, in a stack of emails and instant messages that would make this one of the first murders in America ever orchestrated over the internet. To understand what happened to Bruce Miller, you have to understand the woman he had married just months earlier. Her name was Shari, and she was about 20 years younger than Bruce. The two met at his scrapyard in Flint, and, after a whirlwind courtship, eloped to Las Vegas in April of 1999. To Bruce, it was a fresh start. What he didn't know was that his new wife was living a second, entirely hidden life, one that existed almost entirely online. Sherry Miller lived that hidden life almost entirely in America Online chat rooms, where a person could be whoever they claimed to be. Behind the screen, she carried on relationships with multiple men at once, reinventing herself for each one. She would later describe the men in her online world in chillingly detached terms. As levels in a video game, each one another challenge to conquer, and the man she drew in deepest was named Jerry Cassaday. Jerry Cassaday was, in many ways, the last person you'd expect to be manipulated. He was a former police officer and homicide detective from the Kansas City area, a man who had once investigated crimes for a living. But by the time he met Sherry online, his life had unraveled. He was struggling with alcohol, had lost his job, and was deeply lonely and depressed. Into that vulnerability came Sherry, offering attention, affection, and the promise of a future together. They exchanged countless emails and instant messages, and Sherry flew out to see him in Nevada, where he was working in casino security. Jerry fell completely in love and began talking about marriage. But to clear the way for that future, Sherry spun a web of devastating lies. She told Jerry that her husband, Bruce, was a violent, abusive man. She told him Bruce was connected to the mafia and dangerous. And most manipulatively of all, she told Jerry that she had become pregnant with his children more than once, and that each time Bruce had beaten her so badly that she lost the baby. None of it was true. But to Jerry Cassaday, sitting alone with his depression and his devotion, it was a call to action. He came to believe that the only way to protect the woman he loved and to avenge the children he thought he'd lost was to kill Bruce Miller. And so, in early November of 1999, Jerry Cassaday drove roughly 800 miles from Missouri to Michigan. He went to Bruce Miller's salvage yard and he shot him. Then he staged the scene to look like a robbery, took the cash, and drove back home. Bruce's body was discovered that same evening. For a time, the misdirection worked. Sherry even tried to point suspicion toward an ex-boyfriend of hers, but no evidence connected him to the crime, and the investigation stalled. What ultimately unraveled the whole plot was tragedy layered upon tragedy. In the months after the murder, Sherry cut Jerry off. She stopped returning his messages, rebuffed his talk of marriage, and moved on to someone new. For Jerry Cassaday, already fragile and now consumed by guilt over what he had done for a woman who had discarded him, it was more than he could bear. In February of 2000, Jerry took his own life, but before he did, he made a decision that would bring the truth to light. He gathered his evidence, placed it in a briefcase, and left instructions for his brother to open it in front of a lawyer. Inside that briefcase was everything. Jerry had kept printouts of the emails and instant message conversations he'd exchanged with Sherry, a written record of her lies, their plans, and the manipulation that led to Bruce's death. He also left a note taking responsibility for the killing and stating plainly that Sherry had helped set it up, that she had wanted her husband gone and her money kept, and that he had proof. When investigators recovered the messages from Jerry's computer as well, they had something almost unheard of at the time: a digital paper trail of a murder conspiracy, preserved in the participants' own words. Sherry Miller was arrested in February of 2000 and held without bail. At trial, prosecutors built their case on those recovered conversations, walking the jury through the emails and instant messages line by line to show exactly how she had reeled Jerry in and pointed him at her husband like a weapon. After deliberating, the jury convicted her of second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison. But the case was far from over, and it wound through the courts for more than a decade. Sherry's attorneys argued that Jerry Cassaday's final note should never have been shown to the jury because Jerry was dead and could not be cross-examined. In 2008, a federal judge agreed, ruling her rights had been violated, and the following year, after nearly 9 years behind bars, Sherry was released on bond, to the horror of both families. The legal battle that followed climbed all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court and back down again. And in 2012, a federal district court reinstated her convictions, finding that Jerry's dying words carried enough reliability to stand. In 2014, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed that decision. Cherie Miller went back to prison, where she remains today, at the Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Michigan. For years, Cherie insisted she was innocent, but in 2016 she finally put an end to the question herself, writing a letter to the court in which she confessed. She admitted that she had been living two lives and was terrified of being exposed for who she really was, and that rather than let her family or Bruce's family discover the truth, she chose to have Bruce murdered. "I planned a murder and went through with it," she wrote. "I cannot deny this anymore." The case has been revisited on 2020 Forensic Files, Snapped, and Dateline, and it earned its place in criminal history. Really chilling example of how the anonymity of a screen could be turned into a murder weapon. But strip away the technology, and what remains is painfully old. A trusting man was murdered in his own workplace. A vulnerable man was manipulated into becoming a killer and lost his own life to the guilt of it. And at the center of it all was a woman who treated the men in her life as pieces in a game, until two of them were dead. Linda Sturmer, Lawrence, Michigan. On the night of January 7, 2007, in the rural community of Lawrence Township in Van Buren County, Michigan, neighbors saw a house on County Road 215 erupt into flames. But the fire wasn't the worst of what happened there that night. When emergency crews arrived, they found the homeowner, 42-year-old Todd Sturmer, in the yard outside, badly burned and gravely injured. He had managed to escape the burning house, his upper body engulfed in flames, only to be struck by a vehicle in his own driveway. Todd died a short time later. Investigators would determine that he was killed by a combination of burns and blunt force trauma. The vehicle that hit him was the family van, and the person the state says was behind the wheel was his wife, Linda. Todd and Linda Sturmer had been married for about 14 years and were raising a family together in that Lawrence home. To the people around them, they were an ordinary rural Michigan couple. But by the beginning of 2007, the marriage was in serious trouble. Divorce was being discussed, and according to what prosecutors would later present, there was a specific recent fracture that turned an unhappy marriage into a deadly one. Todd had just discovered that Linda was having an affair. The account the state built was that the murder came only a day after that discovery. The sequence prosecutors described as chilling in its brutality. On that January night, Linda sent the couple's sons out of the house, telling them she and Todd needed time alone to talk about their separation. Once the boys were gone, the state alleged, Linda struck Todd with an object, doused him and the home, and set the house ablaze. Todd, however, did not die in the fire. Somehow, terribly burned, he made it out the front door and into the yard. And it was there, prosecutors said, that Linda got into the family van and ran him over, the final act that ended his life. When first responders arrived, they found a burning house and a dying man who had very nearly escaped. Linda Sturmer told a very different story from the start, and she has never stopped telling it. By her account, the fire was a terrible accident. She said there had been an oil lamp and candles burning inside the house, and that the blaze began on its own. As for the van, she insisted she never meant to hit her husband, that in the chaos and panic of the fire, she was pulling the vehicle out to go get help, and struck Todd accidentally without even realizing it. In her telling, she wasn't a killer at all. She was a wife caught in an unimaginable tragedy. Investigators and prosecutors didn't believe her. The fire was ruled an arson. The timing, a day after Todd learned of the affair, pointed to motive, and the sheer improbability of the sequence, a man surviving a house fire only to be run down in his own yard, struck them as far too much to be coincidence. Linda Sturmer was charged with premeditated first-degree murder and felony murder in the course of arson. Her first trial took place in Van Buren County in 2010. The jury found her guilty on both counts, and because first-degree murder committed during an arson carries a mandatory penalty in Michigan, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For most defendants, that would have been the end of the road. For Linda Sturmer, it was only the first chapter. Her case became the subject of national attention and true crime coverage, and behind the scenes, new attorneys began scrutinizing how her first trial had been handled, particularly the fire science at its core. They argued that her original defense lawyer had failed her by not consulting a fire expert to challenge the state's claim that the blaze was deliberately set. Arson science had come under intense scrutiny across the country in those years, with a number of old arson convictions collapsing once modern experts re-examined the evidence. And in Sturmer's case, the argument gained traction. In 2018, a federal judge vacated her conviction, finding that she had not received a fair trial, and she was released from prison on bond after having served nearly 9 years. In 2020, a federal appeals court affirmed that decision, agreeing that her rights had been violated by her attorney's ineffective handling of the evidence, and it ordered that she be given an entirely new trial. So, 18 years after Todd Sturmer's death, the case went before a second jury. The retrial was held in spring of 2025 in Van Buren County, and it stretched across roughly 3 weeks, drawing national coverage. This time, Linda's defense leaned fully into the fire science argument. Her team contended that faulty analysis had produced a wrongful conviction the first time around and put forward a striking alternative theory: that Todd himself had set the house fire, possibly to collect insurance money, and had died as a result of his own actions. The couple's own sons testified. The prosecution, for its part, urged the jury to see through what it called years of shifting explanations, and to recognize that a man does not survive being burned alive only to be accidentally crushed by his own van. On April 11, 2025, after deliberating for less than 7 hours, the second jury reached the same conclusion the first had. They found Linda Sturmer guilty of first-degree premeditated murder and felony murder. 2 juries, 18 years apart, had now unanimously found that she killed her husband. At her sentencing on May 19, 2025, Van Buren County Judge Kathleen Brickley did not hold back, describing the murder as more gruesome than most, and saying she could not fathom the suffering Todd endured in his final moments. She called the case a labyrinth of lies and imposed the only sentence the law allowed: life in prison without parole. Linda Sturmer remained defiant to the end. Standing before the court, she declared that she was innocent and wrongly convicted, said she had come hoping the truth would finally show Todd's death was an accident, and vowed that this conviction, too, would one day be overturned. Todd's family saw it differently. His mother spoke of a father who never got to see his sons grow up or meet his 6 grandchildren, and his sister described how her faith in the justice system had been shaken when the first conviction was thrown out. It's worth stating plainly where this case stands. Linda Sturmer maintains her innocence and continues to insist Todd's death was a tragic accident, and her defense raises real questions about the fire science involved, questions that once helped free her. But 2 separate juries, considering the evidence nearly 2 decades apart, reached the same verdict, that on a January night in 2007, Todd Sturmer was murdered by the person who should have been closest to him. And today, Linda Sturmer is once again serving a life sentence for his death. Nancy Seaman, Farmington Hills, Michigan. On the afternoon of May 12, 2004, in the middle-class Detroit suburb of Farmington Hills, Michigan, police officers approached a Ford Explorer parked outside a family home. They were following up on missing person calls. A 52-year-old man named Robert Seaman hadn't been seen in days, and his family was frantic. When officers looked inside the SUV, they found him. Robert's body had been wrapped and loaded into the cargo area of his own vehicle where it had been for 2 days, and the woman who put him there had, in the hours after his death, simply showered, driven to work, and taught her 4th-grade class as though it were any other morning. Her name was Nancy Seaman, a beloved, award-winning elementary school teacher, and Robert's wife of 31 years. To the community, the arrest was almost impossible to absorb. Nancy Seaman had no criminal history and a spotless reputation. She and Robert, known as Bob, who owned a batting cage business, had raised 2 sons and, from the outside, seemed to have everything. A home in an exclusive neighborhood, classic cars, even a plane and a boat. But beneath that comfortable surface was a marriage that both sides now agree had become deeply unhappy, a marriage the two camps in this case would come to describe in irreconcilable ways. Here is what isn't in dispute. On the morning of Monday, May 10, 2004, in the garage of the Seaman home, Nancy killed Bob. She has never denied it. The entire case, then and now, hangs on a single question. Was this a premeditated murder or a desperate act of self-defense by a woman who says she survived decades of abuse? Everything else flows from those two competing answers. Nancy's account is that of a battered wife who finally fought for her life. That weekend, the couple was on the brink of divorce. Nancy had secretly arranged to move into a condo. She testified that on Monday morning the two had the worst fight of their marriage, that Bob confronted her about leaving, came at her with a kitchen knife, and chased her into the garage, where he shoved her to the ground. Terrified, she said, she grabbed the nearest object she could find. "I fought like my life depended on it, because it did," she would later say. "If I didn't kill him, he would have killed me." Her defense argued she suffered from battered woman syndrome, a condition they said explained both why she had stayed for so long and why, in that moment, she believed she had no other way out. Prosecutors saw a colder story, and they built it out of the days surrounding the killing. On Sunday evening, Mother's Day, at 7:37 p.m., a Home Depot security camera recorded Nancy buying a hatchet. She said it was meant for chopping a tree stump in the yard. Hours later, that hatchet became the murder weapon, and the wounds themselves became the heart of the prosecution's argument because they did not look like a single panicked swing. Bob Seaman was struck roughly 16 times with the hatchet and stabbed more than 20 times with a knife, well over 30 wounds in all. To prosecutors, that degree of force wasn't self-defense. It was overkill, an attack that continued long after any threat was gone. Then came the aftermath. Nancy didn't call police or her sons. She cleaned the garage, bleaching the floor, buying a tarp, gloves, and duct tape, wrapped Bob's body, loaded it into her SUV, and went on with her life for 2 days. She even shoplifted a second, identical hatchet and returned it with the original receipt in what prosecutors called a deliberate attempt to erase the trail to the weapon. That, they argued, was not the behavior of a victim. It was a cover-up. But the most wrenching part of the Nancy Seaman trial wasn't the forensic evidence at all. It was the sight of her 2 sons taking the witness stand on opposite sides. The couple's younger son, Greg, testified for his mother. He told the court he had seen bruises on her for years, that a person can only fall down so many times, and he described his father growing increasingly volatile. The older son, Jeff, testified for the prosecution. He said he had never witnessed his father abuse his mother, that he'd never even heard her make the accusation until she wanted out of the marriage, and he believed she had simply snapped and then lied to cover a cold-blooded killing. 2 brothers raised in the same house by the same parents stood before the same jury and told 2 completely different stories about what went on behind that family's doors. The case became so defined by that rift that it was later chronicled on national television under the title Blood Feud. Nancy Seaman's trial took place in Oakland County in late 2004 before Circuit Judge John McDonald. The jury faced a real obstacle in weighing her defense. Under Michigan law at the time, testimony about battered woman syndrome was tightly restricted, limiting how fully jurors could hear that side. After deliberating only a few hours, they rejected the self-defense claim and convicted Nancy of first-degree premeditated murder, a conviction that carries an automatic life sentence without parole. And then the case took the extraordinary turn that has kept it alive for 2 decades, a turn that came from the judge himself. After the trial, John McDonald grew deeply troubled by the verdict, convinced that Bob Seaman genuinely had been an abuser and that the jury had never gotten the full picture because the law had kept crucial evidence from them. In August of 2005, in a highly unusual move, McDonald reduced Nancy's conviction from first-degree to second-degree murder, saying the evidence didn't support premeditation. The prosecution appealed, and the Michigan Court of Appeals reinstated the first-degree verdict. The legal battle stretched on for years. In 2010, a federal judge went so far as to overturn the conviction entirely and order a new trial, only to be reversed on appeal, largely on technical grounds. In the end, Nancy's first-degree murder conviction stood, and her appeals ran out. What makes this case endure is that same judge becoming one of Nancy's fiercest advocates for freedom. McDonald, who has said he handled at least 20 murder cases and never once lost sleep, has called this the one case that bothered him, insisting he has no doubt Bob was a batterer and that Nancy should never have been convicted of first-degree murder. He has joined clemency campaigns pressing Michigan's governor to release her. But there has always been an equally firm voice on the other side, and it deserves the same weight. Bob Seaman's family has never accepted the abuse narrative. His brother Dennis called what Nancy did unthinkable and said Bob did not deserve the death he got. To them, and to the prosecutors, the purchased hatchet, the more than 30 wounds, the shoplifting scheme, and the 2-day cover-up all point to one conclusion: a planned killing, dressed up after the fact as self-defense. Today, Nancy Seaman remains at the Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility, still serving her life sentence and still insisting she acted to save her own life. More than 20 years later, the question at the center of her case has never truly been settled: a battered woman who finally fought back, or a calculating killer who hid behind that defense. What is certain is that Robert Seaman died in his own garage, at the hands of the person who knew him best, in a case that split his own children down the middle and has divided everyone who studied it ever since. Sandra Lane, West Bloomfield Township, Michigan. On the afternoon of May 18, 2012, a 911 dispatcher in Oakland County, Michigan, answered a call from a terrified young man. He was 17 years old, and he was calling to say that he had just been shot by his own grandmother. As the dispatcher listened, still on the line, more shots rang out, and the boy cried that he had been hit again. When police reached the condominium in West Bloomfield Township, gunfire was still echoing from inside. Officers ordered the shooter to put the weapon down. She came out and, according to the prosecutor who later described the scene, said 6 words that would define the case: "I murdered my grandson." The teenager, Jonathan Hoffman, was found inside with a faint pulse. He was rushed to the hospital, but he could not be saved, and the woman who had killed him was his 74-year-old grandmother, Sandra Lane. To understand how a grandmother came to shoot her own grandson to death, you have to understand the fractured household they shared. Jonathan Hoffman was a teenager caught in the middle of his parents' divorce. With his mother and father living outside Michigan and going through a difficult separation, Jonathan had come to live with his grandparents, Sandra and Fred Lane, in their West Bloomfield condominium so that he could finish his final year of high school. On paper, it was a stable arrangement, a struggling teen given a home by family. In reality, the household was under growing strain. Jonathan, by multiple accounts, was a troubled young man. He had a history of drug use and was on probation, and his grandmother would later say his behavior had become more than she could handle. Sandra Lane painted a picture of an elderly woman overwhelmed, frightened by her grandson's drug use, by the company he kept, and by his volatility. In April of 2012, roughly a month before the shooting, she did something that would loom large over everything that followed. She bought a handgun. She said she purchased it out of fear that her grandson's friends were dangerous and might come after her valuables. And in the weeks before the shooting, she practiced firing that gun at a range. The confrontation that ended Jonathan's life came on May 18, 2012. Earlier that day, Jonathan had failed a drug test, a result that, given his probation, could have sent him back into the legal system. According to Sandra Lane's account, Jonathan was desperate to escape the consequences. She said he demanded $2,000 and her car so that he could flee Michigan, and that when she refused, an argument turned physical, and he struck her. Fearing for her safety, she testified, she reached for the handgun and fired. But the evidence told a story that a jury would find impossible to square with self-defense. Sandra Lane did not fire once or twice. She fired 10 rounds, striking Jonathan 6 times, including twice in the back. And the single most devastating piece of evidence was the 911 recording. It captured Jonathan, already wounded and pleading for his life, telling the dispatcher what his grandmother had done, and it captured what happened next. Rather than stopping, Sandra Lane shot him again, while he begged for help and while the dispatcher listened, helpless, on the other end of the line. Investigators also noted that there was no sign Lane herself had been meaningfully injured in the supposed struggle. To prosecutors, this was not a frightened woman defending her life in a single panicked moment. This was someone who had wounded a boy, paused, and then returned to finish what she started. Sandra Lane was arrested at the scene and charged with first-degree murder. Her trial took place in early 2013 in Pontiac, Michigan, and it drew national attention, in part because of the wrenching image at its center, a grandmother in the dock, and a teenage grandson whose final words had been recorded as he died. On the stand, Lane wept and insisted she had acted out of fear and desperation, and her defense worked hard to portray Jonathan as a dangerous, out-of-control teen who had left his grandmother with no choice. Prosecutors countered that whatever Jonathan's troubles, nothing about them justified being shot 6 times, and that the 911 tape spoke for itself. The jury was given a choice between first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and acquittal. On March 19, 2013, they found Sandra Lane guilty of second-degree murder, along with a felony firearm charge. The verdict suggested a jury that did not fully accept the premeditation of first-degree murder, but flatly rejected the claim of self-defense. Later reporting revealed just how central that recording had been. During deliberations, jurors played the 911 call over and over, unable to reconcile a boy being shot again as he pleaded for his life with any notion of a grandmother acting in fear. On April 18, 2013, Sandra Lane was sentenced. Before the court, she spoke through tears, saying she had cared deeply for Jonathan and had done everything she could to help him, and blaming his parents for failing to respond to her pleas to get him treatment once his drug use began. "I know what I've done," she said. "There isn't a moment in my life I don't feel pain." The judge sentenced her to a minimum of 20 years, and up to 40 for the murder, plus a mandatory 2 years for the firearm charge, a term that, for a woman her age, amounted to the rest of her life. Her appeals in the years that followed were unsuccessful. Both the Michigan Court of Appeals and the state Supreme Court declined to overturn her conviction. The case struck a nerve across the country precisely because it defied the roles we expect. We think of grandmothers as protectors, and of a home shared with family as a place of safety. Jonathan Hoffman's parents, whose son's lifestyle and choices had been picked apart in open court as part of his grandmother's defense, called the guilty verdict a vindication for him, and that, in the end, is the hardest truth of this case. Jonathan Hoffman was a struggling 17-year-old with real problems, but he was still a child, and his last act on this earth was to call for help and tell a stranger that the person who was supposed to protect him had shot him instead. Sandra Lane remains in a Michigan prison to this day, serving the sentence for taking her grandson's life. Luann Sine, Bay County, Michigan. On the night of January 18, 1990, in a home in Bangor Township in Bay County, Michigan, Timothy Sine was ambushed inside his own house. 2 intruders broke in, forced him to the floor, and shot him, execution style, before staging the scene to look like a robbery gone wrong. Tim, a father who by his family's account loved little more than being out on his boat and fishing, died there in his living room. For a short time, it may have looked like a home invasion by strangers, but it was nothing of the kind. The 2 men who forced their way in had been paid to be there, and the person who hired them was the one who knew Tim Sine best, his own wife, Luann. More than 3 decades later, this case has never stopped generating argument because 2 irreconcilable versions of it exist side by side. To the prosecution and to Tim's family, it is a calculated murder for hire staged as a burglary, driven by money. To Luann's supporters, it is the story of a battered woman who saw no other way out of a violent marriage. Keep both of those in mind, because the facts of this case sit in the space between them. Luann and Timothy Sine were married and together ran a health food store in Bay City. They had a young daughter. By January of 1990, the marriage was ending. Luann had filed for divorce just before Tim's death, and in those divorce papers she made grave accusations that Tim was abusive, that he was addicted to drugs, and that he had threatened to kill her and their child. Those written claims would become one of the central battlegrounds of the case, because Tim's family disputed them from the very start. His sister insisted, publicly and forcefully, that Luann had never been beaten, and that Tim had never used drugs at all. From the outset, there were two completely different portraits of the same man. What is not in dispute is the mechanism of the killing. Luann did not carry it out herself. The murder was committed by two young men connected to her life, James Blau, who was 20 and worked at the couple's store, and Sean England, who was just 18. On that January night, the pair went to the Sine home. A shot was fired from outside, wounding Tim. The two then broke in, forced him down, and killed him, and afterward tried to disguise the crime as a robbery. When the case came together, it did so largely through the men Luann had recruited. James Blau testified that she had asked him, twice, to kill her husband, telling him she lived in fear of Tim. But the prosecution's theory of why she wanted Tim dead was not fear at all. It was money. Investigators told the jury that Luann stood to collect on a $300,000 life insurance policy on her husband's life, and that she was determined to have him killed before their divorce was finalized, so that she would inherit as his widow rather than walk away with far less as his ex-wife. That financial motive, the insurance payout, and the timing against the divorce clock, is what allowed prosecutors to frame the killing not as a desperate act, but as a cold, premeditated plan. Luann Sine was charged with first-degree premeditated murder and conspiracy, and in February of 1991, a jury convicted her on both counts. Because first-degree murder in Michigan carries a mandatory penalty, she received life in prison without the possibility of parole. Blau and England were likewise convicted for their roles. For most of the people involved, that appeared to be the end. Luann Sine went to prison expecting to die there. But over the decades that followed, her case became something larger than itself, a rallying point in a broader reckoning over how the justice system had historically treated women who killed abusive partners. A clemency project focused on incarcerated survivors of domestic violence, joined by law students working on her behalf, took up her cause. Their argument was that Luann had endured years of severe abuse, that she had called police again and again only to be ignored, and that she had turned to murder solely because she believed there was no other escape. In their telling, she was a battered woman failed by every system meant to protect her. Her own account evolved over time. In her clemency application filed with her daughter's help, Luann acknowledged that her thinking back then had been, in her words, terribly wrong, while maintaining that she had acted out of fear and desperation after more than a decade of abuse. Strikingly, both of the men who carried out the killing came to support her release. James Blau, long since paroled, and Sean England, still in prison, who said that if the state itself saw merit in her claims, that ought to count for something. The campaign succeeded. In December of 2022, Governor Gretchen Whitmer commuted Luann Sine's life sentences, with the governor and the Michigan Parole Board citing the belief that she had been a victim of domestic violence. After serving roughly 32.5 years behind bars, Luann Sine, by then in her 60s, was released, formally paroled in early 2023. But that decision did not resolve the question at the heart of the case. If anything, it reopened it. For Tim Sine's family, the commutation was a fresh wound. They have never accepted the abuse narrative, and they point out what the courts noted long ago, that there was no police record of the abuse Luann described. Tim's brother remembered him as a wonderful younger sibling. His daughter, who was just 7 when her father was killed, described him simply as a normal dad and spoke of how painful it was to hear him recast as a monster to justify his own murder. The Bay County Prosecutor's Office formally opposed the release, arguing that Luann's abuse claims had no basis in fact, and that murder victims risk being treated as an afterthought. And so this case ends where the whole story has always lived, in genuine, unresolved dispute. What is certain and beyond argument is that Timothy Sine was murdered in his own home in January of 1990, killed by 2 young men his wife had hired, and that a jury convicted Luann Sine of orchestrating his death for a life insurance payout. What remains contested is everything underneath that. Whether she was a calculating spouse who arranged a killing for money, or a desperate woman driven to a terrible act by years of abuse, no one stopped. More than 3 decades later, the state of Michigan decided she had suffered enough and set her free. And Tim Sine's family believes justice was undone. Both sides are still speaking. The truth of who Lou Anne Sine really is may be the one thing this case never fully resolves. 8 women, 8 lives taken, and a single, unsettling thread running through all of them. Some of these cases were as cold and calculated as anything you'll ever hear. Others live in genuinely disputed territory, where juries said one thing and advocates, and sometimes even the judges themselves, came to believe another. We've tried to give you both sides and to let the facts speak, because the truth in these cases is rarely as simple as the headlines made it sound. But through all of it, there's one thing we never want to lose sight of. Behind every one of these stories is a real person who didn't come home, a husband, a grandson, a stranger, a child. They were more than the worst moment of someone else's life, and they deserve to be remembered. So now we want to hear from you. Of these 8 cases, which one disturbed you the most? And which one did you find yourself still arguing about after it ended? Was justice truly served or not? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one, and the conversations you have down there are some of the best on this channel. And if there's a Michigan case or a case from your own state that you think we should cover next, drop the name below. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you for spending this time with us. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new documentary. We release true crime stories like these every week. Until next time, take care of yourselves and stay safe out there.